Welcome back, everybody. Of course, you know me. My name is Dr. Keith McNally. This is Coach's Corner. Now, I'm going to be really careful with this one. This is Jennia D'Lima,
Yep.
and we're going to talk about her success through 2023 and through 2024. Now, at the time of this recording, it is the tail end of February 2024. We're just about approaching March, and you have had some really good success keeping clients, getting clients. But before we get into that, tell us what you do for a living. What is your profession? What do you call yourself? And let's get into the conversation.
I'm a book editor, so I do edits for fiction and creative nonfiction. I also do a lot of book coaching, and that usually happens prior to the manuscript being ready for a full or complete edit. So I do both, and right now it's a mix where it's probably 75% editing and 25% coaching.
So, are you looking for clients on the editing side of the coin or the coaching side of the coin, or does it really matter?
It doesn't really matter. I'm happy doing both. I enjoy both. And then a lot of the time, my editing services will end up having like baby coaching sessions where instead of a whole hour, we'll have a 10-minute talk about the plot or a character or something else that might need some heavier revision.
So now I'm curious, how did you get into book editing? I mean, is that did you get like graduate from college and they said, this is it, this is what I'm gonna do?
No, if only I had. So I have a master's degree in applied developmental psychology. I always thought that I was going to end up in research in some way, but everything that I did, including in grad school and before then, there was always some writing or editing component. So obviously writing lots and lots of papers for an academic field, editing on all of those. I worked for the National Head Start Association. I did an internship there. And then I did another internship in Alexandria, and they both required that I write documents for in-house use. So it was just a shift away from that sort of writing and editing to fiction and then creative nonfiction. And that did take a while to happen.
Well, whoa. So you used the term creative nonfiction.
Right.
Yeah. Is that a niche? Because I know what fiction is, I know what nonfiction is. So what's in the middle there?
So creative nonfiction, the most popular type that people are aware of is the memoir.
Okay.
So you are taking elements, narrative elements from fiction, and then you're applying them to a nonfiction manuscript.
Okay. I think it's kind of like my book, Walking the Path. I talk about leadership. It's kind of like a personal leadership development journey.
Mhm.
But I wrapped it around a narrative. So it's basically a
Yes.
fable about some young kids, and specifically a young man named John, who's trying to pursue other efforts in life other than what his parents, especially his father, expects of him. And so I think I get the idea perfectly.
Yeah.
And so I probably should have gone to you to edit it because what I've been told, as I've had conversations, it is in publication, but I went back to have other people look at it, and it's very obvious. It's a good book, and I've had some good reviews on it, but it's very obvious that I didn't have it professionally edited. But that's enough of me. You've been having some success
Mhm.
with clients, and I think it's based on our talk offline, is your comfort level. Talk about that. How, as a business owner, as a small business owner, as an entrepreneur, as the person in charge of everything that you've got to do,
Yes.
what's your comfort level taking on
So
new clients?
I think it's important to note first that I really value being genuine and authenticity. So if I ever do something with marketing, for instance, and it doesn't feel like me, I'm almost unable to do it.
Yeah.
And so that even comes across when people are posting ads for an editor in one of the online spaces. I don't like using that sort of copywriting language to describe myself because it's not how I would describe myself.
Well, then
And so I
talk
just
about it.
have a hard time pushing past and forcing myself to do that. And so I end up not doing it. But I think as a result, sometimes my replies don't stand out as much as they could, simply because I'm not using that emotionally targeted language.
Well, then how do you describe yourself? What comes out authentically?
I like to put the focus more on the client or the potential client than myself because ultimately they're the one that I'm going to be serving and helping. So
Mm.
I want to know what their goals are for publication, what steps they've already taken, if they need help in other ways beyond just editing. Because we all know when we get into publishing or someone who's written their own book, there's so many other steps that follow, and it can be a little overwhelming to then say, well, I've had this edited, now what? So I like to help them with that too. And that's partially, again, why I then ask them, what other steps do you need help with? Do you have ideas for how you'd like to publish this? So I really just try and focus on them and what their needs are, and then I answer how I can address those.
So what are the biggest challenges that your clients come to you with?
Ooh, so I think with a lot of them, there is the insecurity about whether or not their book is good enough. And I want to put that in like quote marks almost because good enough is going to differ from person to person. And so much of that is just really maybe they're afraid of what the reviews will say. Maybe they're afraid they won't get picked up by an agent or like a traditional publishing house. And that's totally understandable. And I think a lot of that also comes from knowing that the percentage rates for those types of acceptances are so, so low. So it's just like editors have all these other editors that they might be feeling like they're competing against when it comes to finding clients. Authors feel the same way when it feels like finding their audience because there are so many other books out there. And how do you make your book stand out? So I think in a way too, that also helps me relate.
So let's talk about that a little bit if you can. Having hold and understanding where you fit into the larger picture, how does one differentiate themselves in such a way that you do attract attention? Somebody does come to you for, hey, um, I connect with what you're doing. Let's work together. How does that first conversation start?
Usually well, thinking back, because now I usually have people come to me, not the other way around. But in the beginning, it was something where I would answer an ad and I would tell them, congratulations on finishing your manuscript and letting them know that that alone really is a major accomplishment because it is. That's a huge endeavor that you've poured all this time and effort into, and sometimes your emotions as well. So then to finally have that complete really does deserve some sort of celebration. So I let them know that that alone is something to be proud of because I honestly believe that it is. I couldn't finish a book.
Well, I tell you what, it took me a year, every day, basically 15, 20, maybe 30 minutes, jotting down some notes. And I did it old school, and old school because I'm old. I wrote it on paper first. I wrote it on paper first and then went back and put it on, put it on the computer. And sometimes it flowed well and sometimes it didn't flow well, but it was very much a strategic, intentional effort. And so when it was finally done, you're right. I did feel good about actually getting it done.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that they need to hear. This isn't, and I want them to know too, and I do think this is something that did help me stand out, even if maybe I didn't realize it at the time, that I want you to be able to celebrate each of these steps. I want you to have someone who's going to support you as you're going through all of these different items on the list to get to, the end
Mhm.
publication. It's not just here's your manuscript a month later and then the communication stops. I really do become invested. And I feel like if they feel it's a success, then that means that I was successful in what I did.
Well, I like that because having that relationship, that partnership, that both people are invested in the journey really makes all the difference. Because if it's just we do have business relationships, but you really
Mhm.
get an idea when somebody else is, you know, affectively invested. They're spiritually invested. They are all into the project. And that really shows up. That's really a key difference between somebody who's, just doing their job and somebody who really wants to see somebody else be successful.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I know that there are different, sets of advice that I've seen given about how to have professional boundaries, but I also don't think that it hurts to be friendly and to care for your clients.
So you host a podcast, yeah?
Yes, I do.
So how does that kind of mix into everything else that you do?
Well, so the focus of the podcast is writing and editing, hence the name, writing and editing. And a lot of my days are really spent home alone. So it helps give, just because that's the nature of working as an editor or an author full time, you do tend to do a lot of work by yourself alone. And I don't have an office to go to or anything like that where I have coworkers that I mix with and talk about my day and that sort of thing. So it really helps from the social perspective. It gives me a little bit of that time to just talk to someone else who's in the industry, someone who else who gets it or understands, or maybe they've encountered similar problems and they like chatting about them, whether we do that directly on the podcast or before or after recording. But it's also just fun to meet other people that are in the industry. I mean, I just greatly enjoy that. And it's an easy way to network too, without having to leave your home or worry about geographic distance that separates you.
Well, then I got to ask, who has been the most interesting or the most fun person? And you can't say me because it's only been recently, uh, that you have had the opportunity to talk to or talk with.
Well, this might sound silly, but one of the authors that I edit for, I know that her husband is extremely supportive of her. And so every time I've spoken to him before, it's always been with her there or because I'm meeting her somewhere and he's also attending. And so I had him on the podcast and it was our first time really talking one on one. But I got to ask him all these questions about someone who is both someone who works with me and who is now my friend. And there was just this extra element of enthusiasm and joy to it, and also comfort because this is someone I already know. I don't have to worry about, are there going to be lulls in the conversation? Will I run out of questions? Will they ask me something that I'm not comfortable with? All of that was a lot more enjoyable. Plus, we could tease each other a little bit too, and there's some extra.
It's always good to have somebody who can carry the conversation with you, whether you know them well or not. And so one of the most difficult things of hosting a podcast is, are we going to get stuck? Do I want to sound like
Yeah.
this is scripted? But on Coach's Corner, this isn't scripted at all. And so you've been really good as a guest.
Well,
But
thank you.
on the other side of that, when you're sitting with somebody and there is that kind of, maybe it's a vibe or that frequency or whatever people call it, spiritual or whatever you want to call it, that the conversation gets stuck. How do
Yeah.
you, as a host, kind of jump in and say, I need to do something differently to make this work?
That's a good question. So I think the key component is really listening to the other person and then trying to, because I keep mine free form also. So
Mm.
I might have the opening and then the closing typed out just so I don't forget, the exact name of who's going to be on and then who will be on next. But for the most part, I also keep mine open and I like to just keep letting the momentum carry itself. But yeah, I really think that listening is what really matters because they're going to have said something that you can ask them to elaborate on, or you'll have picked up there's something that they're passionate about. And it might not have been related to the exact question that you were asking, but the hint was still there. So
Mm.
then, how do you take that and unravel it a little bit so you can keep that momentum going again?
And I like that because so much is critical to the flow of the conversation. Now, we've probably both, and I know I have been on not many, but a few other podcasts where it's very strict, it's very structured, and it's like, okay, I'm going to ask this, I'm going to ask that. And it almost feels like there's a loss, not that it's a bad situation, but that there's a loss to the conversation because if I've said something that does pique somebody else's interest, but it's their format to go, okay, we're going to the next question, then there may be this element of the conversation that gets totally lost. And so I
Yeah.
fully appreciate the fact that you allow this thing to kind of ebb and weave, to kind of flow, because it really does give power to the experience itself.
And it's more natural too, I think, because when we're just having a conversation with someone we've met, say we're at a party or a business event, and we're really trying to get to know that person, we're not going to pull a list of questions out of our pocket that we use it for every single social situation. And I'd be like, well, I checked off all 10, so now it's time for me to leave and move to the next person. And it can sometimes have that feel also just depending upon, their tone of voice and then how quickly they move from one to the other, because you also lose that smooth transition from
Yeah,
question to question.
yeah. You know when somebody isn't really kind of listening, um, they're thinking about as soon as you stop, I know what I'm doing next. So I totally get it. And so as a podcast host, how do you keep that energy level up? You have got to go in some way, form, or fashion prepared for the conversation because it's all you. It's your space, it's your situation, it's your podcast, and you want to leave the experience good, feeling good. You want your guests to leave the experience feeling good and feeling powerful. How do you keep that energy level?
Well, you're more practiced at this than I am, so I almost feel like I should ask you this question. So far, I think it's just been natural enthusiasm going into the interview. I look forward to interviewing people because I have the advantage that I'm able to select who those people are and say yes or no, depending on a variety of factors. But I do like looking into the person before I give an absolute yes. And I think that makes a difference too, because especially if they've been interviewed before, you get an idea of their interview style and how they react to the host and that sort of thing.
Totally agree. Because sometimes it's really difficult if you don't have that information up front and you haven't seen them before. You are opening yourself up to uh, maybe some risk, definitely some discomfort, and much what do we call it? Ad-libbing in the moment because you just don't know. And so I've got some stories with some other people who host their own podcasts who didn't do the pre-screening element beforehand and were totally shocked by things that go on in a live conversation. But I think for you and for me, we've kind of passed that. And so it's always good to know that you're heading into a conversation with somebody who's going to give you that respect, give you that audience, give you that flow of the conversation. One more thing before we end this particular conversation is what's the name of your podcast? How do people get on your podcast for those who are in that market? And how can we get in touch with you for those who have written or are in the process of writing a book? Because you have a lot of value to give to people,
Oh,
and they're
thank
going to
you.
miss out if they don't get in touch with you.
Well, the podcast is called Writing and Editing, and it's not and typed out, it's the ampersand. You can find it on Buzzsprout, which is where the website is, but it's also on all the other listening platforms like Apple and Spotify and so on. Not on YouTube with video yet, just not as tech savvy as some other people, and I'm not sure I want to try splicing audio and video, but you can find it there. And then you can also contact me through the website, or you can go to my website if you're interested in editing services or seeing what I have to offer. And that's jenniaedits.com. But you can contact me there as well if you'd like to be a guest on the podcast.
Jenya, I appreciate this conversation. And I'm going to put all of those links and everywhere you are in on the internet in cyber world in the description of this video and the show notes. Thank you so much for this conversation. For those of you who have been watching and listening, I'll see you next time. Take care.